Hello, and welcome to Academic Perspectives on Conspiracism, a podcast about the research that's being done on the place of conspiracy theories in society, culture, and politics. Each episode is a conversation with an academic about their research on a different aspect of conspiracism. I'm Adam Coper, a postdoctoral fellow with the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data here at Cardiff University. This week, we'll be looking at how the internet and social media platforms can influence conspiracy theorising. I'll be talking with Tommaso Venturini about his research into 4chan and how the structure of 4chan affects the development and spreading of conspiracy theories. Tommaso is a researcher at the Centre for Internet and Society at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in France, and an associate professor at the Media Lab at the University of Geneva. Welcome, Tommaso.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. So today I want to talk to you about your article from 2022 for the Theory, Culture and Society journal titled Online Conspiracy Theories, Digital Platforms and Secondary Orality Toward a Sociology of Online Monsters. And what really interested me about this article was the way in which you compare conspiracy theories to oral culture, or you use the idea of oral culture to understand what's going on with conspiracy theories. And before we get into speaking about what it means to talk about oral culture, I was wondering if you could give a bit of background on this research, and specifically for those who might not know, what is 4chan and why is it sort of so important?
Yeah, so that is actually that paper is actually the beginning of a research project or a research program that I'm still carrying on and sort of right in the middle of. Maybe we'll speak about that later on, but I was trying to sort of basically set the basis for this program of research. And the idea came from the fact that I've noticed that, and as many other people, that conspiracy theories online were actually quite different from those that, people had been studying for a long time. Some of the, some of the classic idea of conspiracy theories were the same, and actually, there are scholars that have made the argument that the internet has been a great place for conspiracy theorists. For reasons that don't surprise me, we can discuss about that. But recently, other scholars, such as, for example, Moorhead and Rosenblum, in their famous book, a lot of people are saying, kind of noticed that the conspiracy theory a little bit have maybe lost the theory in them. Right? Yeah. They famously call them conspiracy without theory, which I think is a very nice expression. And by that, they mean that whereas classic conspiracy theory and even like online conspiracy theories in the early day of the internet and the web used to be in many ways similar to science. They used to mimic science and kind of course, it was, it's always been a sort of pseudo-science. So not exactly, there were a lot of problems with that, but at least, the kind of format or the genre, if you want, as a literary genre that conspiracy theories used to look up to were scientists, and researchers and people in the academia. And then suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, but recently, conspiracy theory changed a little bit. I'm sorry, this is my dog.
Oh, it's all right. Happy to have a dog on the podcast.
in his own opinion on controversy theory. And so basically conspiracy theories then shift to a quite anti-scientific type of discourse, right? Instead of trying to do as scientists, they, even in a sort of style that they have, they position themselves like in a way that is opposite to that of academic science. And that particularly in places in online platforms. So there is this new type of conspiracism, if you want, or the new style of conspiracism. It's very present in platforms, which includes both the fringe of the mainstream platforms, such as Instagram, YouTube, Reddit, etc. But also in fringe platforms such as 4chan. And 4chan, since you asked, is a is a kind of tiny but very influential platform that has been the cradle of a lot of far-right, alt-right memes, but also more generally of a lot of internet memes. And so it's internet because it's interesting because it's in a way, okay, it's both interesting because it's strong alt-right association, which we may discuss, but also because it's in many ways it's very, to me, I think it kind of distill or maybe push to the extreme some of the features of online communication. So it's a good place to see stuff that is so extreme that it makes quite explicit and evident other things that we also observe elsewhere, but maybe to a lesser extent in ways that are maybe less clear.
Yeah, I remember when I was a young teenager and I tried going on 4chan because I'd heard there's this cool website called 4chan. You should check it out. And I remember going on and just thinking, where do I log in? How do I make an account? And, what are all these weird long usernames with all the digits and everything? And it's where Pepe the Frog came from originally, right? And a lot of Donald Trump or pro-Trump memes originated from there. But I think what you were saying about the scientific aspect really interests me because in my own research, I've done a little bit of looking at JFK conspiracy theories, and there it is like the complete opposite to what you get on 4chan, where you have lawyers making arguments about in long books about the evidence and should we, interviewing different people who were there on the day of the assassination, talking about bullet trajectory and the science of the fragmentation of bullets and can they bounce off of, concrete and all this sort of stuff. And then with the sort of conspiracy theories you're talking about, it's like the complete opposite. Like you were saying, it's almost like a anti-science aspect of that. And one idea that I thought was really interesting that came up in your paper was evanescence, which, to be honest, I didn't really know what it meant before reading your paper because I just associated it with that American rock band. But it's kind of like impermanence, right? That there's a sort of impermanence to conspiracy theories on 4chan, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I think the 4chan has been studied for, it has two main features that have been studied a lot. And that, as I was saying before, I think are brought to an extreme in this specific platform, but in a sense, they're also kind of quite typical of internet culture or internet subcultures, to be more precise, in general. And the first one is anonymity. It's what you were referring about. Like you can log in and you can sign up to 4chan, but people don't use it generally. They tend to just post anonymously under the pseudonym Anonymous. By the way, interestingly, the whole anonymous movement actually also come from 4chan. And that's, they're called anonymous because they started to organize through 4chan and using the pseudonym Anonymous. And that has been studied a lot, and it has an important effect of kind of liberating the word, the speech of people expressing on 4chan, because basically there is no risk. You're running the risk because you're not attaching your persona, not even your online persona, to what you are saying, because you're just anonymous. So it's not even, so that may be an interesting distinction to make here between pseudonymity, where there's a lot of places online where you are pseudonymous, where you speak under a pseudonym, which means that you're not, again, you're lowering a little bit the risk of speaking out, but not entirely, right? Because a lot of people care about their online persona and their pseudonym, and don't want to, they don't want to take risk on such persona. But in 4chan, everyone is anonymous, so no one knows who's speaking, not even among the community, right? And which means that people speech can become extreme and hateful, by the way, quite quickly, and that's what happened. So that has been studied a lot. But there's a second feature, which I think is even more interesting and maybe have been studied less, which is the evanescence or ephemerality, if you want, of 4chan. 4chan has, by construction, no archive, no memory. So everything is, so 4chan works as a set of forums. There's a few dozens different forums, which in which people can post images and text, such in many other forums. But there are relatively few of them compared, for example, to Reddit, right? So it works a little bit like subreddits, but there are less than that. And even if the community of the platform is smaller, it's still very big compared to the few dozens of forums that they have, which means then stuff gets pushed down and forgot very quickly, right? Because 4chan has no recommendation algorithm,
right,
or no recommendation system really. So there's no algorithm that select the best or more interesting or more popular post, and there's no way of upvoting posts as you would in, for example, Reddit, right? So what happens in 4chan is that stuff is always chronological. So the last thread is at the top of the list, and then the second last, and then et cetera, et cetera. And thread can move up in the list. In 4chan, they said that that can be bumped up by a new comment. So the first thread is the one that been either the last that have been published or the last that have been commented on. But because there's a lot of people publishing and commenting in 4chan boards, all posts, all threads get pushed down very quickly. And there's been people then doing statistical research on this, and depending on which board you look at, apparently thread disappear from the front page, so from the first like 10 or 15 posts in sometimes a few hours, sometimes
right,
a few minutes.
That's
and,
quick.
and like the very, very popular posts maybe would on the smaller board may remember a few days, but that's it. And then that's very rare. Generally is more hours than days. And even if you are very popular as a thread, you cannot be bumped up. You cannot be commented more than a limited number of comments, which change a little bit on the boards, but it's around 300 posts, which means that even if you are very popular, after a while you basically, as a thread, you are dead. You will be pushed down and then moved to a temporary archive for 3 days and then completely deleted from the platform. So there's really no archive to 4chan, and stuff like disappear from the platform very quickly, which again, I think it's very extreme for 4chan. But if you think about it, it's also kind of the way in which many other platform works. Like ideally, you do have an archive for Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, for example, but no one really go back, look at stuff. I don't think no one really goes searching for tweets that have been published 2 months ago or even like 2 weeks ago.
Right,
Scholars would do maybe, like people that want to, like historians of platforms might do, but users don't really do it.
And with this sort of the kind of limit that is placed upon a thread, you kind of talk about how conspiracy theories as they develop on 4chan kind of have to be, or is it like put in a new thread and summarized, and sort of that involves a kind of bit of interpretation about what do you include, would you not include? Am I right there? You used the phrase, I really liked it, perpetuation without preservation. So could you explain a bit about that, about how this sort of perpetuation without preservation occurs?
Yeah, so that's actually very interesting work that has been done by my very good friend Mark Tutors and Sal Egan at the University of Amsterdam in the Open Intelligence Lab, which I really recommend to check out because they're doing really great work on this kind of online subculture, particularly like the far right one. And one thing that they have studied quite extensively is precisely how the 4chan community, particularly in the political board, the famous or infamous /poll, basically fight against these affordances of the platform, this ephemerality of the platform. And what they do is that they basically constantly repeat and reformulate it and remix the ideas that are most important to them by constantly reposting the same, what in 4chan is called the general threads. There's a bunch of general threads. So there's, the normal threads, and then there are the general threads, which are called general because they live on.
Okay.
And again, they live on not because they, as all other posts, they're closed down after the 300 or something, 350 comments, but then people reopen another thread with the same title. The famous one is the Trump general. It's the general for talking about Donald Trump. And then what they would do is they would do a little summary of like what has been said before. And then by that they reopen the post. So it's a very weird organization that do not concern all the threads in 4chan, but do concern some of them. In other cases, like I don't say in the majority of cases, stuff that resonate in the community is picked up and repeated, not necessarily in such an organized way, but still in a way that sort of repeat and renew the same idea, while also in a way remixing them and making them fresh and new. So it's a very interesting. I think it is the general way in which internet memes are generated, and not just the internet memes in the literal sense. So maybe images with an overlaid impact font, which that would be like the most common type of memes. But of course, there are. I think there are other things that should be construed as internet memes, such as some viral videos, some TikTok challenges, or some point of views that are retaken and replayed. But there's so a lot of things that nowadays like kind of look like memes, and they look like memes to me precisely because they are generated and more than generated, extended. Like their life is extended in this ephemeral environment of online platform, not just 4chan, but all of online platform, by the fact of repeating them again, but repeating them with some variation. So I really think it is this repetition with variation that is the core of internet memesis.
Right, yeah. I mean, as you were saying that, the one that came to mind for me was, I'm sure you've heard of this, the steamed hams meme. Yeah, the one where they've taken a clip from Simpsons with Principal Skinner having to cook burger. Oh no, the idea is he's going to have steamed clams and then he has to go out and get burgers or whatever. And this was like a meme a few years ago where people were constantly kind of editing it, making new versions, kind of doing it so it's like, oh, every time the word ham is said, it speeds up twice, or and then I forgot about it, and I went just a few weeks ago. I found online that it's still going on. It's still going strong. People are still making these edits. I saw one that was like what was it? It was a kind of early 20th century style German rendition of steamed hams, where someone had acted out, and it was just keeps on going through this interaction and reinterpretation. But you use the term secondary orality when you're talking about what goes on in 4chan and conspiracy theories. And I suppose that's tied to the whole idea of evanescence. But could you explain a bit more about what is secondary orality and how you kind of use it to understand conspiracy theories?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the example you were giving before is actually very interesting, right? So there is this stuff that is not supposed to last that long, right? It's just a joke. Like the Simpson M, but there are like many other. Papa the Frog itself is also a little bit in that category, and then in ways that are surprising, in a sense, ended up living for a long time, like and carry on and on, and and like generation after generation of internet user keep like re-rolling other users.
Oh yeah.
This kind of there's this kind of like traditions, if you want, that stays for a long time, despite the fact that's interesting. bit, that internet media, and particularly online platform and social media platform, have very little memory, as I tried to explain before, right? They're not made for archiving stuff. That was the case for, I think it's important to make a little distinction here before I come back to the secondary orality idea. The original web and the original internet were supposed to be libraries.
Right.
Like people that really, like if you go back and read Tim Berners-Lee and, you know, sort of all the people that developed these technologies, they were archivists and librarians. They're people that really had in mind to build this like new distributed library that would conserve and make human knowledge accessible to everyone else or anyone in the world. And the web worked like that for quite some time, actually. You know, website and blogs to some extent look like that. And then something happened around the year 2000 with the rise of internet platforms, when it's actually a double movement. On the one hand, the amount of content that was available online was so big that the idea of making it constantly accessible, of archiving it, suddenly seemed very improbable.
Right. Yeah.
And on the other hand, platforms like make that even worse because they allowed even more people to access, which is a good thing. Like they made the internet much more diverse, but also much bigger, right?
Yeah.
In terms of content. And so, and also they had to find a way to monetize their and sort of pay back for the huge investment that they made in sort of infrastructure, both software but also hardware. And the solution that they found in the 2000s is basic advertisement, which had been around for a long time. The advertisers have been paying for communication infrastructure for a long time. But in the early days of the web, that was a bit unclear, right? It was a lot of public funding, really. Right. But then there were people still trying to do paywall, subscription, these kind of things. But then sort of Facebook and other platform came along and said, no, it's going to be advertisement. And when your whole economy is based on advertisement, it becomes an attention economy, of course, as many people have said. And in an attention economy, what you want is not stuff that is that's archived and stable and permanent. You want flows, basically.
Right.
You want flows of content, because then you can intersperse them with ads that you would use to monetize all this. And so we basically there's been a switch from a web of document, which is the web 0.1, as some people call it, to a web of flows, and that would be the web 0.2. And in the web of flows, sort of all the archiving and documenting and recording and storing, utopia goes out of the window. And instead of that, what becomes important is the recommendation system, both the algorithmic one and the manual one, sort of the one made by the user. And so we suddenly find ourselves, or gradually find ourselves, in an attention regime or a communication regime where everything is ephemeral and evanescent, and there's no way of stabilizing stuff. And
right.
And to me, that reminds me a lot what happens in oral cultures, because oral cultures there's a very substantial and interesting literature about the shift from orality to literacy, which happen across various invention of new introduction of sort of intellectual technologies, the alphabet, of course. And writing, but also the printing press, which basically sort of take writing up to a whole new level. And basically what scholars of culture have shown is that the main difference between orality and literacy is that in literacy now you have a way to write down stuff. So you don't have to constantly repeat the ideas that are more important to your culture, because you can write them down and then store them in a library. which is something that oral cultures cannot do, right? So they have a little bit, and now you can see why I like this analogy or metaphor, a little bit like online cultures, which also, for the same reason we discussed about 4chan, but if you think about other platforms, I think it's a little bit the same. Online subculture has no way to preserve the things that are important to them, that their Simpson have, by writing it down somewhere. They can do. There's still initiative like that. You can think of Wikipedia. You can think of Know Your Meme. So that has not disappeared entirely, but it's a sort of like less important way of communication. The main way you would do it just by repeating it, remixing it, as you say.
Right.
And there's this one of the people who worked on orality, the primary orality, the orality before literacy is Walter Onk, who's a very interesting person itself. He was a scholar of Marshall McLuhan. He did his PhD thesis with Marshall McLuhan, and then he wrote this very influential book on orality. And in this book, he kind of mentioned, in unfortunately quite a sort of a passing way, it says, well, maybe electronic technologies, and he was thinking, of course, at radio and television, but it says maybe electronic technologies are taking us to an era of a secondary orality, which kind of resemble, it says, under many, it has a lot of features that resemble those of primary orality. And I always thought that this idea was really, really clever. I think that it couldn't be used to talk about what's happening. So, all this, precisely this mimetic dynamic that we discussed before, in a paper that I recently published with Sal Hagen, we call that the mimicry.
Okay.
So this mimicry, these mimetic dynamics, are very similar to the way in which oral folklore is preserved, again, by repetition with variation.
Right. And I think that, as we kind of come towards the end, one thing that I've been wondering about is, how does this kind of secondary orality aspect of internet culture generally, but specifically conspiracy theories, how does that kind of affect, I don't know, maybe I'm getting too close to my own discipline here or bringing my own stuff in, but how does it affect politics, basically? Does it kind of lead to more kind of rumor, hearsay that then can kind of spiral out of control? Is that the kind of one aspect of it? I think you give the example of Pizzagate, right, in that in that paper. I mean, is that an example of where sort of the orality has sort of led to sort of harmful outcome?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What I would say is that, so starting from conspiracy theory, and then we can talk a little bit about politics. But for conspiracy theory, being in this extremely ephemeral communication environment means that the kind of pseudo-scientific approach does not work anymore, right? Because suddenly the kind of stuff that you would do as a classic conspiracy theory to pretend you're a scholar would be sort of to set up a library of a canon of important texts, to collect evidence and then connect them. There's like the classic image of the conspiracy theories is the crazy wall, where there's all these evidence and documents,
with
and
string going between.
Yeah, exactly, the red strings connected, and right. You cannot really do that online in online, but it doesn't really work. It works on some platforms. Like, I guess you could still do it in maybe in Reddit, in some platform, such as specialized discursive platform, or your own website, which some conspiracy theories still do, right? I just also published a paper just very funny with Federico Pilati on the Flat Earth Society.
Oh, right, that sounds interesting.
And the controversy that existed at some point between the Flat Earth Society, on the Flat Earth Society original website, the official website, which is a classic conspiracy theory. They have a library in the website, and they have this very long post where people do exactly what you were saying before on JFK, like they bring in piece of evidence, and discussing them and trying to sort of decipher them in extremely elaborated way. And then the subreddit of the Flat Earth Society or Flat Earthers, which was just memes and jokes and
Right.
people repeating the same jokes all over again with some variation, right? And the contrast is really stark, right? Because precisely in the subreddit, they decided to go in another direction and go in the direction of like mimesis, right? And repeating and
Right.
remaking the joke and remixing it, etc., etc. And what happened is what you would expect it would happen, right? So they had a completely different type of culture that or conspiracy, if you want, that is not based on accumulation, but it's based on repetition with variation, and with all sorts of problem of extremism and stuff you would have, to the point that actually now the subreddit has been shut down.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, the original conspiracy theorist won again in this particular case, won against the conspiracy memist. I think
they shut down because of their kind of extremism.
Yeah, because it became very there was a lot of hate speech. There was and also the discussion was just people constantly trolling each other. It became untenable, so they shut it down. Which means that like classic conspiracy theories still exist, right? And still exist online. They have not been replaced. There's a fight going on, and they will probably survive one to decide to the other. And then kind of similar things also happen to public debate in general, or to some part of public debate. I now want to make an argument that is, maybe the only sure thing in media studies is there's nothing replace anything, right? So there's no media do not replace each other, and also inside of media tendency do not replace each other. They all live together. But still, what is happening is that political debate and democratic debate, which for a long time we kind of, the argument that people that study orality and literacy is that democracy was born with literacy, actually.
Oh, right, okay.
Or at least modern democracy, right? People who say that like modern classic democracy was born in Greece with literacy. That's the thesis of Moody and Watts. And then the modern democracy was born with the printing press. And that would be the thesis of Elizabeth Einstein. And in fact, you can print journals, basically. And for a long time, like, that was what we had in mind when we say the public debate or public opinion, if you want. Like, we have this kind of literate type of discussion, right? That happens on basically newspaper and books. Kind of. And that kind of is also a form of science. It resembles science a little bit, right? Not exactly the same thing, but there's this idea of the rational politics and stuff, right? Which has always been an ideal and always been true, but at least this kind of ideal exists. And then again, electronic media comes along, first radio and television, which we're not going to discuss because that would be another podcast, but they also changed the way in which to do politics. And then the internet comes along, and in the beginning the internet did look a lot like an archive, so it didn't shake things too much, but then it became something else. As I said, it became to some extent a secondary oral place. And then a whole new type of politics come in, which is sort of maybe a secondary oral politics, which is not based on some rational argumentation, not even like complex argumentation, and like,
is it more emotional?
It is maybe more emotional, but it's also maybe more based on what is memorable and repeatable.
Right. Okay.
Again, because if you use the analogy of the oral society, again, people cannot remember what has been said, right? And if you think, and so for them to remember, you need to repeat the same, for example, political argument again and again, and it'd be memorable, so probably short, and maybe also emotional, because stuff that sort of arouse emotion is easier to remember.
Right.
And then you have like this kind of completely new type of political discourse, a new type of political, well, they're not completely new, but they always exist. But like someone such as Donald Trump, You know, if you like, people do that all the time, like journalists do that. They transcribe what they write down what Donald Trump says, and they make fun of him because if you look at the transcription, it makes no sense. Like, and they're kind of surprised at like how people can even buy this thing. Like, just read what he said, but no one read what Donald Trump said. The people listen to what Trump says. Like, it's an oral argument, and you cannot. I think it's wrong to judge it on the basis of a literate conception of democracy and politics. Of course, I'm not defending Donald Trump, but I think that like fact-checking Donald Trump or debunking Donald Trump or writing down and then submitting what he said to a sort of rational, pseudo-scientific or quasi-scientific discourse really missed the mark. That's not what happened. Is making jokes, is making memes, and it's very effective with that. Sometimes effective, sometimes less effective. But that you have to think in that way. And then if you think also, like, because you brought it up, the Pizzagate or QAnon, this stuff, like when you look into them, it makes no sense, right? It's so extreme and so it looks like a caricature, and people are super, like, a lot of observers are super surprised that this stuff is successful online. And I think that is because they take it as if it was a classic written argument, which is not. It's maybe an oral folk poem, right? You feel like it's a folk tale.
That's a really interesting way of putting it.
It's a folk tale, then it kind of some of this stuff work.
So a folk tale, QAnon as a folk tale. I love that idea. I mean, I don't love QAnon, but I love the idea of it being a folk tale, because that then brings in that kind of sense of that, that, like you were saying, that it's not all about just being strictly rational or scientific, that it's much more about, I don't know, telling stories, making people feel things. I've also seen people argue that with QAnon, that it kind of, people can kind of get some, I don't know, enjoyment or satisfaction out of just kind of playing the role of the investigator, right? And so it's almost like the game has shifted so much, and that kind of more scientific, archival part of the internet, or way of like understanding political discourse, doesn't quite fit onto what's going on, really. Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the people are being, that there's a huge moral panic about fake news, for example, which I think to some extent is warranted, to some extent not. But fake news can only describe what I think is a relatively small part of the misinformation that is circulating online, and it's the sort of pseudo-scientific type of misinformation, the one that sort of is still inspired to this old way of doing politics, literate way of doing politics. But there's a lot of other misinformation that is not fake news, in the sense that is not try to fabricate a piece of news that look like a proper news, like this, and so it's not trying to convince, it's not trying to pass itself as a like a mainstream or official news. It's not really not doing that. Is maybe doing maybe a super hyper partisan point, or a joke, or the parody of something, or a meme, or the remix of a song, or whatever. And that's kind of thing you cannot approach as a fake news, because it makes no sense to. It's not fake, it's not news either. So it's neither fake, not news. I sometimes call that junk news. I like it better. I published a paper on that. I think junk news is slightly better than fake news, because at least it gives the idea that you consume it not because you believe in it, but because it is addictive.
Right.
Again, addictive in an oral way. It's something that is easy to remind and to repeat.
Right. So I guess following on from that, my last question to you would be, I mean, you've kind of hinted at it with the talk where you were saying about junk news and fake news, but how worried should we be about it? And is there anything we can or should do? Because I know that some people even say, like you were sort of suggesting with the fake news panic can be a bit overblown. And there are some people who sort of suggest that you don't really need to do anything about it, that it's just, leave it be. But do you think that we need to sort of act to kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say stamp out these conspiracy theories, that might be a bit extreme, but are there measures that we should be taking as democracies to sort of protect ourselves from the worst, the more extreme aspect of these sort of like, I don't know, folk tales?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's actually a good question. And I think that, for a starter, it would be actually very useful if we could distinguish the one from the other and have like words and a language to distinguish one from the other. Because there is still stuff that look like a fake news, right?
Right.
There's still people trying to fabricate piece of evidence or piece of news that look like the official news, but they're not. And those for those we still, I think, like the classic tools of debunking and fact checking and this kind of things, is still relevant, and we should still keep doing it. But then there's also a lot of other stuff that's happening, which again do not follow the same logic. And for that stuff, actually debunking and fact checking may make things worse, right? Because if the problem is something, if the problem is that you're trying to oppose this as a viral hate speech meme, for example, debunking it is also a way of amplifying it or repeating it, right? You're still repeating it. So by repeating it, you're giving it a longer life. And if you don't, it might sort of disappear by itself. So those things are better maybe left alone. Doesn't mean that they will disappear, because the Simpson M have been there for a long time, so they might be there. But you cannot really sort of debunking them does not work. And I think that is important, because, like, for example, now there's this whole new moral panic about deep fakes.
Oh yeah.
And artificial intelligence for misinformation. And for sure there will be people that do kind of deep fakes, which means sort of using artificial intelligence to make stuff that really look like an interview that maybe a sort of a political person might have been given, and it's not. Stuff like that, or leak false photos or somewhere, or also false footage of content. That's scary. And that is the kind of thing that you should contrast with fact checking and debunking. But there's also a lot of people that will use, and are already actually using artificial intelligence to do memes and provocation and jokes and this kind of like hate speech jokes and trolling behavior. And those you cannot really debunk. That makes no sense. It doesn't really change anything. You have to act with that. Sometimes it's called cheap fake. It's also like
cheap fake.
An expression, that's a cheap fake. And cheap fake, everyone knows that it's cheap, right? Everyone knows that it's fake. The problem is not saying that it's fake. Everyone knows. The problem is, how do you avoid this stuff from polluting public discussion to the point that everyone is distracted by the latest meme that everyone is laughing about, and do not do the careful, painful and like time-consuming work of talking about issues and talking about politics. And so I think what the best that we can do there is funding and supporting sort of good old journalism.
Yeah,
I still think there's nothing better to improve public debate than making sure that newsrooms and journalists can work in good financial and political conditions. I think that's really the best thing you could do.
Yeah. I have a lot to say about that kind of the financial aspect of journalism today, but I'll leave that for another day, another conversation. So we've come to the end of our time, but thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation.
You're very welcome, Anand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of another episode of Academic Perspectives on Conspiracism. Thanks again to Tommaso Venturini for this fascinating conversation about conspiracy theories on the internet, and thanks to you too for listening. Please make sure to check out his article. It's called Online Conspiracy Theories, Digital Platforms and Secondary Orality, and it appears in the journal Theory, Culture and Society. I'll put a link in the show notes. The soundtrack is Spy Music by Echo Cinematics, and I'll see you next time.